Sometimes when you're a kid, you dream shit up that you didn't tell your parents. And it's not because what you dreamt was so bad, but because you have no words to explain what the fuck it was you dreamt. Add that I had a dream the night before Halloween. Add that on Halloween night, we've been treated to an added excitement on a bustling movie shoot on our street. And not just any movie, but a scary one aptly named Halloween. But when the strange element of my dreams started playing out for real, albeit in different ways, I wondered why I hadn't tried to do something. The only person I shared my dream with was Ricky, who after Halloween would stop being my friend. As if all this weren't enough, add that Halloween 1978 marked the night that mute old Greg cracked. Like all weird dreams do, mine started normally. Ricky and I were riding our bikes on Meriden Street. And just so you know, Ricky was a girl, but she was different from the other girls in my 4th grade class. In fact, it wouldn't occur to me that she was a girl until we were in middle school. But then her family had moved to a prestige neighborhood where estates were old, where the houses weren't houses but mansions, and Ricky would become a cheerleader and continue pretending she didn't know me. In the dream, Ricky rode next to me in her too cool BMX bike. I remember how she turned and squinted her big lash brown eyes at me and said, "We should be dead siblings for Halloween." Dead what? I had no idea what a sibling was, but I remember thinking, I'll ask my mom. Right after saying that, Ricky dipped down into one of the steepest streets I've ever seen. So steep, the thought of joining her scared me, but I gathered all of my wits and dipped my nose in my cheap Sears stingrays on the precipice and followed. The entire ride down felt like a free fall, like the tires on our bikes were no longer touching the ground, and the sick feeling of all my organs lifting and crowded under the upper torso overcame me. At the bottom of the hill was old man Gregory, who wore no pants, but had a Star Trek shirt on. You know, the kind Mr. Spock and Captain Kirk wore. His wrinkled crotch looks nothing more like my own boy parts, so I sort of stared. If that wasn't weird enough, old Greg, as we called him, had a surgeon mask over his mouth and nose. Miraculously, as it happened in dreams, we were no longer on our bikes, but walking and following him into his house. Once inside his house, I remember being extremely cold, as if we were entered a freezer. Old Greg's living room was hazy with frosty air, and instead of regular furniture you find in a living room, there was a makeshift operating room. There was a sheet-covered operating bed in the center of the room, with shiny steel tables on either side. On the tables were scalpels, scissors, trays, and other grisly instruments that glinted in the little light. The table had leather restraint straps to keep patients held down. When I glanced towards old Greg, he had managed to grab Ricky from behind, her arms prone on the side of her, and lifted her into the table. Her legs, arms, even her head stuck out stiffly, just like mannequins. I remember running over and screaming, but in the skewed way dreams can landscape time. Ricky was already tied down when I got to her, except she wasn't struggling or trying to free herself. She was stiff and smiling up at the ceiling in an unexpected way, as if she knew and accepted what would come next. The thing was, I had no idea what that thing was. "Son, you stay away from her," old Greg said, which didn't make sense because everyone knew he was a mute. He held a large butcher knife up to my face, and I stepped back. This pissed him off, and he came at me jabbing in midair and in my direction. "You want your sister fixed, don't you?" In a sudden way that regular the dream state can transform into a lucid dream, I realized I had the power to act, and so I backed away and sped out in old Greg's house, feeling like a coward for leaving my best friend behind. When I woke up, the excitement of it being Halloween helped deposit the dream into whatever recesses of my reserve in a kid's brain for such nightmares. But the tone of the dream, the dreaded sense of it, would linger a long time. It was a school day, so right after my mom helped me get my zombie costume on, I raced out to meet up with Ricky. She was waiting for me in the front row in the mom's house, wearing a ripped up soiled dress and the same white face paint I had. Except her mom had darkened the areas around her eyes, giving her a macabre look my face lacked. As we walked, I got straight to my dream, telling her every detail of it, except the part when I left her behind with old Greg. It was then that occurred to me to ask, "What's a sibling?" "Brother and sister," Ricky said without interest. "By the way, I got us fake blood." "Why do we need fake blood?" "Because zombie boys and girls are murdered," Ricky said with the word murder in the most grisly way she could, drawing out the R's for effect. "There's no way we can put it on now. Remember Miss Jackal said, no blood, no gore." Ricky rolled her eyes. "It's for when we trick or treat, duh." Like I said, the movie Halloween was being shot in our street, and for 2 days prior, all we noticed were a lot of white trucks and a few people. By the time the school let out on Halloween and Ricky and me walked home, the street had been closed to traffic. It was buzzing with hundreds of people running in and out of the van during velvet white Victorians. The house where all and bad stuff was supposed to happen. Since we didn't know what the movie was about, we approached a couple of crew members who were talking in the wardrobe truck. Since Ricky was bolder than me, I let her do the asking. "What's your movie about?" The lady and the man who'd been talking smiled down at us. The lady was pretty with brownish hair and a smart-looking face that softened when she smiled and tousled my hair. "Oh gosh, I don't know if I should tell you. Your mom might not want you guys to know." She smiled and tousled her hair again. But the guy with her laughed. Ricky though was pissed. "We're not brother and sister. So what kind of monster is in your movie?" I cut in, because that's really all I wanted to know. The guy chuckled and reached into the wardrobe truck and pulled out a plastic mask and said, "Well, if you think Captain Kirk is a monster, you'd be right." When he held the mask, we could see that indeed he held a Captain Kirk mask. Confused and feel like cheated by the answer, we walked off, but Ricky suddenly stopped, grabbed my arm with her hand and said, "Oh my God." "What?" I said, yanking my arm away from her in a hard kung fu grip. "In your dream, didn't I say we could dress up as siblings? And didn't old Greg think we were brother and sister?" "Yeah, so? Everybody thinks we're brother and sister." "And old Greg, who was a dentist, who was wearing a doctor's mask and a Star Trek t-shirt," Ricky added, looking genuinely scared. None of what was said would make any sense to me, not yet anyway, which frustrated her. "Wait, that crazy old guy was a dentist?" "Oh my God, you didn't know?" Ricky's eyes were even bigger and she looked genuinely frightened. "What? Being a dentist is bad?" "No. What's bad is that his son killed his own sister. Old Greg tried to save her, but she bled to death." "No way." This was juicy stuff and I wondered why I hadn't heard of it before. "Yeah, well, everybody knows about it, Kyle. It's why he stopped talking." All fear and wonder had left her face and she went back to the task at hand, deciphering my weird dream. "Anyway, just now, the lady thought we were brother and sister, and the mask the guy had a Captain Kirk mask. It's a lot like your dream." Ricky was right. None of it was exactly like my dream, but it was out of the ordinary that those things had matched up. Still, it wasn't enough. These things could easily fall into the realms of coincidence. Again, I hadn't told Ricky about ditching her in a dream either. There were a lot of things we didn't know until later. Later we learned that Mike Myers' mask in the movie was actually a plastic store-bought Captain Kirk mask with eyes cut out and spray painted white. And what neither Ricky or me would know until we were old enough to see Halloween, and no longer on speaking terms, was that the lady we met, the lady who messed up my hair, was Jamie Lee Curtis. That was the happy part of the day. Neither one of us had any idea that the real prophetic part of the evening was yet to come. In those days, parents let kids roam in the streets freely on Halloween. Since we were in the 3rd grade, both of our parents allowed us to trick-or-treat on our own. after we promised to remain within the 4-block radius. Since Ricky had bought the blood, she got to put it on first. Using the ineffective brush it came with, she slathered it on her light gray dress while I stood waiting in the alley behind our houses. "Leave some for me," I said, as I watched the small bottle emptied out more and more. By the time she finished with the bottle, there was enough to rub on my face, and not much more. After I dumped the empty bottle in the nearby trash can, we set off to begin our candy hoarding ritual, carrying our hopefully collected sacks of our sides. Time has no meaning to the 8-year-olds, so looking back, it's hard to say when we ended up back at the movie shoot, or whose idea was it. But before getting there, I remember going from the house to house, being greeted by moms, dads, and even kids who filled our bags with all kinds of candies. It was dark that night, and the Santa Ana winds, or so they called, had begun to blow. Ricky and me stood in the crowd of onlookers in front of the now ghoulishly lit Victorian, with a hot wind blowing leaves, loose hairs, and casting eerie shadows over the windows of the house. The surreal effect of hot winds blow at night added the already surreal experience of watching a film shoot. "Quiet on the set, we are shooting!" Followed by "Action!" The streets died. No one moved, coughed, or turned their heads. But the wind, oblivious to man's silly creation, grew stronger and howled, sending a chill up my back. It wasn't until I heard a harrowing series of screams coming from the inside of the house that I turned my head and noticed that Ricky was gone. No longer next to me chewing on her caramel noisily, Ricky was gone. Weaving through the adult crowd in the streets watching the film, I kept my eyes focused, watching for her gray dress and teased out blonde hair. But nothing. The actress inside of the house set off another pealed scream, again sending cold shivers up my back. When I got up away from the crowd, I looked up heavily treed meridian to see the dark forms of the costumed kids. Some walked, some dashed under the streetlights, interrupting the dancing shadows of leaves that shook in the hot breeze. As I passed these kids on the way north, and away from the glare of the filming location, I caught snippets of their conversation. "Mom's not gonna let you eat that." "Snickers are way better." "Don't do that, that's mine." The last voice was familiar. It was Cassie, Ricky's friend from gymnastic class. "Cassie, stop!" I aimed my voice in the direction of Mary Poppins' costume. "Who's that?" Cassie said. "Kyle. Have you seen Ricky? I can't find her." Cassie replied, "Not since I saw her with you." She turned and ran off to join the group, who raced up to the lawn to the nearby house. Here was when panic set in, riffling through my body and setting off the next course of events. With determination, I head to Old Greg's house, not knowing what I thought I'd do once I'm there. What I did know was that since Ricky pointed out how similar my dreams had been to some of the events of the day, it was a logical place to go. Old Greg lived 2 blocks away, so I ran towards it, ignoring all the dark shadows of kids in costumes that I passed and bumped into on the way. When I got to his tall, unkempt yellow house, he was sitting on the lawn chair of his yard, a huge plastic jack-o'-lantern filled with candy at his side. Old Greg looked up with me without smiling. Our eyes met, and I took in a clouded, caricatured frankness of his glance. I stood my ground on the concrete path leading to his house when I remembered that Old Greg didn't speak. "My friend Ricky, have you seen her?" What I really wanted to say was, "You have her, don't you?" But I didn't have the nerve to. The old man shook his head. "She's dressed like me, but in a dress with blood." His hard, focused look shook me. There was something wrong with this man. There was an intensity about him, like he was boiling inside and ready to burst. "Can I look?" He stood from his chair, stretched, and looked back in the front door, hunching his shoulders and indicate his lack of concern. So I walked towards the porch, climbing to the steps, and stood at a wide open door. That his living room wasn't made up and looks like an operating room didn't faze me. But even so, it was the same room. The walls, the windows, the fireplace, and the mantle were all set in the same location as in the dream. It was when I heard a wooden floor creak directly behind me, and I turned. Old Greg stood right behind me. He stood much too close, staring into my eyes as if he knew me. From the corner of my eye, I could see that both his hands were shaking at his side and that he was getting ready to speak. "You can search high and low, but I ain't letting you hurt my sister." He looked around the room before turning and heading back outside. The guy was crazy and I needed to leave, but now it hits me that Ricky was out getting more candy than I ever get when I stood at the crazy old Greg's house. Immobilized by fear and frozen in place, there was a split moment before I could bolt the fuck out of that house that I looked towards his dimly lit den to see the look like Star Trek posters on the wall. But even to this day, I can't be sure. As soon as I saw him sit back down on his lawn chair, I sprinted out of there, running past old Greg and the group of costumed kids walking up the path. When I got home, and in the excitement of dumping all my candies into the floor, I forgot to mention Ricky's disappearance to my mom. It wasn't until she walked into my kitchen after taking the phone call and the old worry came back. "Kyle, that was Ricky's mom. She said Ricky hasn't come home yet. Do you think she might have gone somewhere else?" I shook my head, not knowing how to explain how she disappeared. "Kyle, did you see her go home?" My heart was pounding and I knew I had to come clean. We were watching the movie and she went next to me the whole time until what? My mom's face was stern now. Until after the lady screamed and Ricky was gone. Gone? I went looking for her and asked Cassie and she didn't know either. After I was sent to bed, I heard my mom talking to the phone for the rest of the night. Over the course of my sleep, I wake when our phone rang, but sink right back to sleep soon after. Hours later, I woke up in a drenched sweat and headed for my mother's room. She was up and setting up the edge of her bed when I opened the door. "Has she come home?" "No, honey, but the police are looking for her." My mom patted the bed next to her, so I joined her. "They should check old Grade's house," I spat out. "The old man? Why are you saying this, Kyle?" My mom's faced me, and I didn't need to look up at her to know her face was serious and drawn. I didn't answer. I couldn't. What was there to say? I had a dream? That I was gone over myself and checked his house? That things was, even though I had gone over there and hadn't seen anything, I kept remembering what he said about not hurting my sister and a strange, lifeless look in his eyes. "Honey, you need to tell me what you know. You won't get in trouble." My mom faced me on the bed and gripped my arms with both her hands. Her face was drawn and scared. "You need to tell us what you know. Did you see her go there, Kyle?" "Yes." I lied. I had to. In a few minutes, I hear a deep male voice in a policeman downstairs, and when my mom called me down, I knew I had maintained my lie. All of it hit home when I saw a tall man in a dark blue uniform standing in our living room, making the biggest room in our house look like dollhouse miniature. "Son, it's important that we get an eyewitness. No judge will let us into Dr. Gregory's home without a warrant. And to get that, we need a witness." This was when Ricky's mom and dad walked in, without knocking, and joined all the adults who waited for me to speak. "What does he know?" Ricky's mom was frantic. Her red-rimmed eyes looked wide. She came to me, grabbed my arms, and shook me much harder than my mom ever did, and pleaded, "Kyle, what did you know?" "I saw her go into his house. Into old Greg's house." Those words set off a series of actions. It was like when Captain Kirk gave the command and everyone in the Starship Enterprise jumped too. The big cop turned and spoke into the radio with grave tones, and Crackle's response was quick and final. "We've got 2 guys over there now." He turned to leave, and his partner was smaller cop, said the only kind thing that I heard that night. "You did good, kid," before he went out and through our screen door to join his partner. Ricky's parents glared at me. Even as a little kid, I felt their hatred and resentment. Ricky's mom stood to leave, but before she did, she looked down at me and said, "Why'd you wait all night to say something? She could be dead by now." When they left, my mom seemed too preoccupied to speak. She sat by the phone and took up smoking again, all while I trembled in silence. It was a gamble to do what I did. I knew even that in the dreams didn't reflect on what was real, but when the police searched Mr. Gregory's house, It wouldn't take long to locate Ricky. They found her in a crudely dug basement bunker. What they'd find would baffle everyone but me and maybe Ricky. But I didn't know since we never spoke again. In the bunker, Old Grey had set up in an old dental chair and had trays with surgical tools lined up, clean, gleaming, and at the ready for surgery. Ricky was duct taped into the chair, bound and gagged. Her dress had been cut and it was an abdomen to expose her belly. Of the 10 stitches Old Greg had intended, 6 had been completed. 6 futile stitches on the otherwise healthy abdomen. Apparently, when he come out to watch the filming, Old Greg had seen Ricky in her blood-soaked dress, and something had clicked in the old guy. In his deluded mind, Ricky became his dying daughter, and this time it wasn't going to let her die. When they cuffed Old Greg, they said he cried like a child, while repeating that, "The boy is bad." I shivered, recall how he believed me to be his son. The whole time I had been standing in this house, Ricky had been down in the dark bunker, tied up with useless stitches, pulling her skin tightly over a non-existent stab wound, while the only thing in Old Gray's unstable mind was to protect her from me. Although Ricky would undoubtedly be scarred for life, she recovered. Like I said, we'd never speak again. Sure, I want to talk to her. Sure, I want to ask why she hadn't told anyone about my dream, because if she had, her parents would have blamed me for waiting so long to disclose what I knew. But then, I figured Ricky had been through enough, so I respected her need to pretend I didn't exist. Years later, when I finally watched Halloween, it struck me as even more bizarre that its storyline was so similar to the evening of the old Greg's life. How much the story of a kid who stabbed his older sister matched the horror of old Greg's real-life circumstances. As I sat watching the movie as an adult, I would recall the last Halloween I spent with Ricky. Each time the camera panned across the eerie Victorian looming on the tree-lined streets, each time Jamie Lee Curtis pealed out a scream, I'd know that somewhere behind all those cameras stood 2 innocent kids whose young lives would be altered forever.